I'm Dr. Taharka Ade. I hail from Mount Vernon, Alabama, a small town in the state of Alabama in the United States of America. I received my Ph.D. in Africology from Temple University under the advisement of Malefic Asante.
Hello and welcome to Obehi Podcast. I'm your host, Obehi Ewafo, and I strongly believe that everyone has a story to share. Now let's get started into this episode. I really love so much the conversation that we are about to have today as part of the series that we are doing about the life and legacy of people of African descent. In this case, of course, people of the African diaspora. Today, we have the honor to talk to you about Du Bois. Is one of the most respected individuals in the African diaspora. Now, as a form of description, just a kind of a brief description of him, what would you say?
Du Bois is considered perhaps the most prolific thinker, African American thinker of the 20th century. I would say he was perhaps one of the most prolific thinkers, period, in the 20th century, and really the 19th leading into the 20th century. Du Bois lived a very long life. Was born in 1868 in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. And he passed away the night before the March on Washington.
Okay, now we will start with a bit of his background. What do you want people to know about the background of Du Bois, where he was born? I wanted to spend some time there.
So Du Bois, as I said, he was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. He had a very interesting upbringing. He grew up principally with his mother's family, the Burghardt family, and he didn't really have his father around as much, although he had his father's last name. He grew up in a town that was largely white town. But he says in his autobiographies that he would feel racism sometimes in that town, but he perhaps didn't really recognize it as a child to really know what was happening. And then also because he was such a bright and intelligent child in school, he did so much better than many of his white counterparts that they kind of had a respect for him, even if they viewed him as lesser because of his race.
That will actually lead me to talk a bit about the circumstances surrounding the time that he was born, because of course we are looking at an individual now, we are looking at a man, but before we can understand them, we also need to understand the circumstances of the time, because people don't live in void, they live in situations, they have experience. So how would you describe the United States as of the time Du Bois was born? We are looking at him as a young boy growing up in a society, but what kind of a society is it actually?
So where he was living in the United States at that time, again, he was born in 1868, which means he was born 3 years after the end of the Civil War, which led to enslaved people across the country being free. And with, even though the Emancipation Proclamation had come before, but when that war ended, that subsequently forced all slaveholding states to, relinquish or to free their slaves. And so, but at the time that he was born, in the area that he was born, slavery was virtually, it had virtually ended by about the 1830s. So he had a very interesting upbringing, I think, in the Northeast United States, where clearly slavery is still something that is and this notion of race and Black people being lesser at that time is still something that's in the consciousness of even Northerners, but it's a little bit different for them there because they've had a little bit more time to get used to this notion of free African Americans. And so, in terms of Du Bois, um, being born 3 years after the ending of the Civil War, and then growing up in the setting where he's having to, um, one, kind of realize, just who he is, what his identity is, and then also contend with, the other school children of his age. Some of them, just a few of them, were also African American, but many of them were white in the location that he lived. So it was a really interesting time, and Du Bois himself says that uh, he was uh, he wanted to have a better connection with Black people, with African Americans, and there was a moment in his childhood where he was in church and a Black choir came to sing, and it touched him and moved him. He cried in the pews. It's an all-white church, or mostly white church, white-controlled church, basically, I should say. And but they invited this choir to come sing, and it touched him so much, and that was one of the first instances that he realized that he was not as close to African American culture as he wanted to be because of the setting that.
At this time now that Du Bois was going to school, you made mention of him being very bright in the class. For this reason, even those that were like him sort of have a respect for him because of his academic excellence, if we were to put it like that. Then, of course, that is the way it is. Is there anything that we can learn about um, how maybe the society was there? By this time, there is no segregation in school, so the so-called white and the so-called black can school together. So we have overcome the segregation. I don't know if there's anything you can say about that while he was growing up.
So that's an interesting um, thing you just said there. There was segregation in school. Segregation had not really been overcome, but I think Du Bois comes along at a very interesting time in American society where slavery has ended, and we're still dealing with the aftermath of that, and whites are trying to figure out really how they feel about socializing with African Americans as equals, right? And so in the area that he lived, he had the fortune to be able to go to school. There were no, as far as I know, there were no, quote unquote, Black schools, great schools for him to go to. So he had the fortune to be able to do so, and but that didn't mean that that wasn't still the time that children were being told that they couldn't go to school with Black children were being made to not go to school with white children, and or go to school at all, because they at this time they're having to really create their own schools, right? Many, and particularly in the South, schools, even colleges, are being created by formerly enslaved Africans or white philanthropists, or assisting them in creating them. But as far as grade school, he was just in a very unique time and area of the country that that he was able to go to school, and then eventually he gets into Harvard. And it is interesting. All of this happens before the dawn of the 20th century, and by the time you get well into the 20th century, there are more and more laws against Black children being able to go to schools or to be integrated in school systems. And so and Du Bois is living through all of this time. So I'm sure it was very interesting for him to know that, okay, well, I went to a school where, there was quite a bit of white children around. And, but here are these laws that are forbidding Black children from going to school with white children. And I don't really think that was really uh, the concern with, as far as going to school with white children. It was more so the schools that the white children were able to attend were better funded and had the most up-to-date textbooks and things of that nature. So it was about the access to resources that Black children were not allowed to have, more so than the integration factor.
Thank you for that. That clarification is very important. All right. I refer back again when you made mention of the fact that in the school he was quite intelligent. So that is very important also to underline.
Mm.
Is there something else that we might learn from his school days? Maybe because he have participated in an event, or he have been a leader in the school, or you have friends, or any event that could have made him to be more active in the days of schooling?
I can't think of a specific event right now. I'm sure after this interview, something will dawn on me. But one thing I do recall is that there was another Black student in the school that he attended, and I remember reading that Du Bois felt a little bit ashamed of him because he didn't excel as well as he did in academics, and he thought that was he really thought that was a shame. He felt that student should excel even more than the whites. And so I remember him talking about that. Another interesting tidbit, it didn't really have to do with him being in school. As a matter of fact, this happened. So this didn't really have anything to do with him being in school. In fact, this happened just a few months after a few months to a year maybe after he graduated from school, is that he was offered a job to work on to help to assist with construction work on a house that was being built by someone who was at that time considered the most wealthiest widow in America. And her husband, I don't know why his name escapes me now, but her husband, made a lot of money in the railroad industry. And then he dies, and then she goes off to marry someone else, and she moves back to Great Barrington, and she's building a house. And she took a liking to Du Bois, and in taking a liking to him, she made sure he had a job working. So he wasn't actually doing construction. I think he was like a timekeeper. He was making sure that the people who were doing the construction could go on breaks, things of that nature. And so his job was not to do actual construction on the house, right? He was like a timekeeper for the people who were doing the construction. And I believe he said he was getting paid something like $1 a week, or maybe it was $1 a day, but I think it was $1 a week. But at that time, that was a lot of money for him, and he was very keen on saving all of that money, or as much as he could, because he knew he wanted to go to college, and he didn't want to go to just any college. He wanted to go to Harvard. That is what was on his heart. He wanted to go to what he considered the best university, but he didn't end up going there at first. He ended up there eventually, but where he went before that, I think he looks back on his life as something that was a great benefit to him, but also kind of taught him some lessons about himself, which was Fisk University. He ended up in Fisk in Tennessee, in the South, in the segregated South, where he had to, really get used to this notion of being a problem, quote unquote, in American society, as he would put it.
All right. Now, he went to Harvard, and Harvard, like you, of course, pointed out, is not just any university. This is one of the best in town.
Mm.
And of course, I want to imagine that that will also be very expensive. Do we know how he might have financed his education, or anything we can learn about that?
Um, from what I remember, for Harvard, he received some scholarship, but I can't remember from what foundation or what perhaps wealthy philanthropist he got it from. I know to finance his education at I said I know to finance his education at Fisk, he had a very influential preacher who convinced his church and a few other churches to put their monies together to finance him while he was at Fisk. His education at Harvard, as I said, I can't recall exactly where the funding came from. But what I do know is that Harvard, but they would not accept the fact that that Fisk bachelor's was equal to their own. So he had to receive another bachelor's degree while at Harvard before he can go on to get his PhD.
All right, thank you for that. That is very important. In fact, that's something I really find very interesting there. That in this church pastor happened to organize or maybe tell other people to support for the education of Du Bois. I found that critically important because now it looked to me like as if maybe the people are saying we need more enlightened people in the society. We need somebody to also be there to maybe at the end of the day to also represent us or something. I don't know, but I really find that to be a highly valuable as even a thinking to see that it is said that it takes a village to raise a child. This comes
Mm.
very clear now, as it were. Anyway, that is just by the way. Now, in the life of Du Bois, is there somebody we can point a hand on as somebody who could have influenced him, in maybe choosing the path that he went to as a critically important individual in the society at the end of the day, but somebody that influenced him to take this trajectory?
Um, he had quite a few people that influenced him, uh, but they influenced him in different and interesting ways. And so I can't really think of someone who was the most influential in terms of him wanting to better himself in as far as education and to be a scholar and professor. But but what I can say is that he was very much influenced by um, his want and his need to really understand who he was and who African Americans are and what it meant to be a Negro, as what he would have been called at that time in American society. And I think there was a lot of self-propelling influence that he had, but definitely there were individuals around him that that he thought were influential.
All right, thank you for that. Now, he was okay. That is this kind of inborn tendency in him to try and understand the identity of the people that he is part of. Okay, this is very important. At what point in his life can we say this became the dominant goal for him? That this was an area that he really wanted to study, to understand, and to make his impact. Was it when he was still maybe junior in school, when he had finished, when he was in Harvard, or is there anything we can learn about that? At what point in his at the stage of his life?
I mean, when you read his autobiographies, it's almost as if he's saying that this has been with him his whole life. Um, from the moment of hearing that black choir in that church and wanting to have a greater connection with African Americans and African American culture, even though there was a small demographic of African Americans who lived in the town that he lived in, and there was even a African Methodist Episcopal Church that was founded in his childhood. So he had some of that, but um, I think he just really had a longing for really understanding his own people. And so although he could not go to Harvard right out of high school, he was very, very excited about the prospect of going to Fisk, of going to Tennessee to attend an historically Black college, and and to be around his own people. And there was a little note that he made in his autobiographies about his excitement about being around more Black women when he was there. So yeah, so it was very kind of just always a part of him. He gets to Harvard. He is a historian at Harvard, or he's getting his Ph.D. in history. At the time, there was no Ph.D. in sociology, but he's definitely developing the sociologist in himself while he's at Harvard, and also when he studied abroad.
We learn about him growing up, going to school, going to Harvard, and eventually becoming a history expert in Harvard. At what point can we say he actually have gotten to a full bloom in his career, and how did he rise to that point?
We can say that perhaps his essay about Negro strivings was pretty influential. So around 1897 or so, uh, Du Bois is starting to kind of rise as a scholar. People are starting to pay attention to him, and definitely by the first decade of the 20th century, with the publishing of the Philadelphia Negro, as well as the Soul of Black Folk. Du Bois is, starting to really rise at this time as a principal thinker in society, and he's in his 30s. He's still very young, and but his work uh, is very influential at this time, and it's spreading really all over the world. By 1911, you had uh, a Ghanaian um, lawyer and philosopher, if you will, Casely Hayford, who's criticizing Du Bois really of his notion of double consciousness, but that means he's reading Du Bois all the way in Ghana in 1911. So Du Bois, very early on in his career, started to rise.
If we were to say this is the key message that Du Bois was trying to push in the course of his career, we can have a writer who write books. Yeah, we can pick, even though this writer have written like maybe 20 or 10 or 3 or 5 books. If we take it and examine the text, we can see that there is a message on the line that he or she is trying to cut across. In most of the cases, not in all the cases, but in most of the cases, it usually is like this. Um, if we look at Du Bois in this sense, what can we say what his key message that he actually wanted to cut across in the work that he was doing for African Americans or people of African descent, if we want to just put it in general?
Some key points, I believe Du Bois um, would agree to be some key points. Early on in his career, Du Bois was not an integrationist, at least not in the sense of Frederick Douglass. Du Bois was very much felt that that African Americans have a heritage that they should be proud of, and although he, didn't really have an understanding of that heritage that he would have later in his life, he felt that it was something that you shouldn't just assimilate. So I would reframe that to say he wasn't an assimilationist in the same way as maybe a Douglass. And so he didn't feel like you should assimilate to the degree that you just, erase that heritage. But, very early on in his life, he felt that people of African descent had a lot to teach America, but he also felt that America had a lot to teach people of African descent. Now, this is his early 30s, and this is, I'm kind of paraphrasing his comments in The Soul of Black Folk, which, really this portion of it came from an article that he had published a few years prior. But this is where we get the term double consciousness, right? This idea of double consciousness. From what I have seen, I have not seen those two terms, those two words, that term, in any of Du Bois's works from that. Yeah, I haven't seen those two words strung together in any of Du Bois's works from that point forward. The words double consciousness, although we have all of this theory surrounding, this term double consciousness, and what I like to tell people is that Du Bois was barely 30 years old when he wrote that, right? And he lived until he was 95 years old. He had 65 more years of life, 65 more years of intellectual growth that often gets ignored because there's so much focus on things like double consciousness and the talented 10th, which that too he revised as he went on, as he advanced in his career and evolved in his intellectual thought. And so, but we often kind of freeze Du Bois in a time in the early 20th century. And, there might be some minor mention of him being a Pan-Africanist thinker, but I believe that became, very, very much a part of his life and a key point that he would want to get across to people. And he did get across to people towards the end of his life that the West, as he put it, and really a showing of his evolution of thought. I don't think that Du Bois felt that America had too much to show the Negro of the world anymore. He felt that it was part of, and in his words, the pattern of human culture that has led the world to ruin. And so he was putting a lot of stock into the African world and for people of African descent to really, get themselves together and to rise as a superpower that not just in the sense to rival Western powers, but to be able to have some sense of sovereignty and autonomy, so that it's not so affected by the West anymore. And that's what he advocated all the way until the end of his life.
So I was thinking, of course, just before you concluded with this part, try to understand what could have been his whole approach to maybe reach out to other people of African descent, but this time not in the United States, because there are a lot of African descent that are outside the United States, and hundreds of millions of them, from Brazil to Argentina to the Caribbean to the United Kingdom. There are hundreds of them, hundreds of us. So, what do we remember of Du Bois? Try to reach out or extend a hand of fellowship to people of African descent that might be suffering from the same situation of those in the United States, but that are not within the territory of the United States, but who might have a common objective. What do you have to say about that?
Well, Du Bois is considered one of the fathers of Pan-Africanism, right? So he attends the 1900 Pan-African Conference, hosted by Henry Sylvester Williams. And so he attends that conference, and he's very much influenced by, what occurs there. And by 1919, he holds a Congress in Paris, something that actually was not supposed to happen. But Du Bois, in his savviness, found a way to make it happen by leaning on a Senegalese French general at the time who had the power to kind of allow him to hold this conference. And he tells him, you can hold this conference, but don't advertise it. And that didn't work out very well. It got it got some advertisement, but it was interesting. There were 12. It was 50 or so delegates there, people of African descent across the African world. But there was 12 delegates there who hailed from African countries, and so in that Congress was not the last. He had several more throughout his lifetime. There was a second, third, and fourth Congress that he principally organized, along with others. And then the fifth Congress, which is the last one that he attended, he didn't principally organize, but he was kind of made the chairman, so to speak, of this Congress by people like Kwame Nkrumah and Jomo Kenyatta, who were principally the people who were running this Congress. And so Du Bois was very much an advocate of Pan-Africanism and wanted people of African descent all across the African world to unite on political bases.
Thank you so much for that. That is important for you to understand. Okay, at that time, now we see these different Africans from different country, different territory, coming together to organize conference. One of the persons that I did interview did make reference to the conference also in London. I don't know if you make reference to that too. I think Du Bois was also there on Pan-Africanism. So that is important for us to know, because we are trying to study their history. We're trying to understand try to understand what they did and also how they did it, so that, because we haven't got to our destination yet. So it is important that we understand what those before us have done, so we can learn from them and see how we can sort of strategize to keep on fighting until we get to where we are going. We have a destination. How was it even possible for them to go across these national borders, for example? Because now Du Bois is in US speaking English, and is have to negotiate or have to talk with people that are in France. How easy was it to do this cross-continental conference? How was it? What was motivating it? And how simple was it? How complex was it? I don't know what you want to say about it, but I'm trying to understand how it was for them. I'm looking for how they managed to do it.
Well, I'm not sure if Du Bois was absolutely fluent in French. I'm certain he knew he could speak French and could to talk with people, at least enough to be able to do their negotiations or do their organizing and planning and things of that nature. But the Du Bois had a lot of people who supported him and had their own gifts. And so the situation in Paris with Du Bois specifically, he was able to, as I say, lean on this Senegalese general who I always butcher his name. So I was trying not to say it, but Blaise, and I know it's not Diagne, but it's kind of how it's spelled. But I think it's probably pronounced Jean or Jean or something of that nature. But Du Bois had this just kind of eerie way of having people gravitate towards him and having people respect him. Even some of the most advent races of the world, or racist philosophers, I'll put it that way, of the world. For example, and this is a bit off topic from what you're asking, but just to give you some clarity, someone who you wouldn't think at all would have any respect for a Du Bois was Flinders Petrie. Flinders Petrie is known as the father of Egyptology. He developed methods such as seriation and all kind of things that are still used in archaeology to this day. And Petrie definitely looked down on people of any other race. And as a matter of fact, Petrie developed what is known as the dynastic race theory, right? Where he suggested that in Egypt, in ancient Egypt, that the people who are there, uh, the people that you could say are of African descent, are not the people who founded the dynasties or were the governing agencies of Egypt. That was some type of Eurasian influence that came in, and they founded these dynasties, right? Because he could not fathom that people of African descent could found, these great dynasties that and commission these great monuments and have writing so many thousands of years ago and things of that nature. But Petrie, interestingly enough, read Du Bois' Soul of Black Folk, and they had a correspondence. And Du Bois kind of lambasted him in a sense for his treatment of the Egyptian workers and how he did not afford the Egyptian workers the kind of recognition of their humanity and the recognition of the fact that they are worthy of things like an education and a living wage and all kinds of things. And Petrie seemed very, remorseful. I don't know if he changed his ways. I highly doubt it. but in his letters back to Du Bois, he seemed like he really wanted to connect with him, and so he, so he did. So Du Bois had this interesting way of getting people to like him. Now that doesn't mean that everybody did, right? But he definitely had that type of influence. So this calling these congresses and having people from different parts of the diaspora look up to him and respect him, and that was just kind of part of his character. That was part of his power, and then to me that's one of the most powerful things that people can yield, is the power of influence, and that's definitely what he had.
All right, that's great. That's great. All right, so they organized these different conferences from US to UK to France. I think even to some other country. I don't know of Italy, Rome, or anything, but I'm sure that there were many other places that some of these conferences were organized at the time.
Mhm.
In fact, I really do think that Africa were more united then because they have a common goal. Now we are more divided because we believe that we have arrived, but we haven't arrived at all. In these conferences that were organized, what is the outcome of it? What can we say were the outcome of it? Say, okay, we are going there because we want to start a war, or maybe we are going there because we want to liberate ourselves. These are the strategy. We need to do this first, do this one, then do this one, then do that one. What can you say about that?
So I will kind of touch on what you were saying earlier, as well as your question, which is, in these congresses, if you look at the resolutions from these congresses, they're not necessarily, I mean, I guess for their time, they can be considered somewhat radical, these kind of, I wouldn't really call them demands, right? They were not really suggestions either, but kind of this middle of the road, hey, colonial powers, will you have the humanity to allow your colonial subjects to get an education, to be able to get involved in their own politics, their own state politics, and eventually take over their own countries from you, so that or so that ostensibly you have independent nations that on the same level as Europe, and that the world would be at a better place for that. Now, of course, I would imagine even Du Bois at this time thought that these resolutions, and those resolutions continued from each Congress. They refined them and added more and things of that nature. But I would imagine even Du Bois at this time knew that this was a long shot. How do you ask colonial powers who have every interest in remaining colonial powers because of the resources, both human and natural resources that they're gaining from their power in or their domination of these African states, or really of the people, because the states are arbitrary. These are things that the colonial powers themselves created, but they have every interest in remaining in power. How do you ask them to give up that power? So I think they were really kind of searching for methods in getting the international community to see what they were doing, in getting them to kind of shame the West, and perhaps that was quite a method during the civil rights movement. So, but also perhaps the West will eventually see, just as they did see during when they ended the slave trade, England being the first country to do so. They would eventually see that this is a horrific human rights issue, as well as eventually this may end up costing this might end up costing Western powers in some way, when the peoples of these states began to revolt, or whatever the case may be. These were resolutions to put in place in order to have some plan of motion for people of African descent to be able to govern themselves. Now, I look at those resolutions. So I have a book coming out in August on this very thing, on Du Bois. It's called W.E.B. Du Bois's Africa, Scrambling for a New Africa. And I look at these things, and I um, question a few things, as I just kind of alluded to. I question, it was Du Bois and these men, particularly at that first Congress, those 12 delegates from different African nations, were they, being a bit uh, not necessarily disingenuous, but trying to call on or pull on the heartstrings of the Western world to try to say, hey, this is what you should do to be triumphant. As Europeans, you call this the white man's burden to civilize the world. Well, this is how you can civilize the world, and then leave the world in a better state than what you left it. And so I kind of, even though I think that there was perhaps some notion of pulling at the heartstrings, and the way they worded certain things was to kind of give the West a sense of superiority and things of that nature, in order to kind of placate them into doing what they wanted them to do. But I also say that if the language that they wrote in those resolutions stood, and the West actually took it seriously, then what they really were calling for was a further mental, political, cultural, religious colonization of the African continent, right? And really ushering in kind of a neocolonialism, because they're basically saying that. So one of the resolutions says something to the degree of, to allow the native. Now, I found this word interesting, because here you have 12 delegates from African countries, and it doesn't seem like they're referring to themselves as natives. but they're referring to, these people back home, right, as the natives. So I say that, perhaps the native in their mind, are those who have not been civilized, those who are not been giving or allowed a Western education, right? And so, to allow the quote unquote natives to get an education as if the quote unquote natives are not receiving their own indigenous education, right? But an education worthy enough to be able to run these Western governments. And I question, if these natives themselves were asked, hey, how do you view governance? How would you, without, they don't have Western education, they have their own indigenous education. How do you view governance? Do you think these arbitrary borders that the West has built around these countries, do you think they're necessary? Have they not split up your homes, split up your clans, things of that nature? Um, should we be looking at governing in a different way, in ways that is more in line with your own cosmology? All these kinds of things, those things are not asked, right? What is being put forth is that the Western uh, stance to governance, the Western measurement, is the correct one, and and for these the people of Africa to be able to properly govern themselves, they must be properly educated by the West, and then go on to run these colonial governments, and essentially become black faces with black skin, white masks.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Ade, for raising that point. I think it's very important because I think we need to be clear at some point that it is even complicated by independence if what we have in Africa can be vaguely said independent because we don't have independence in Africa. The European came to Africa for the purpose of their interest. It is we that misunderstood them, thinking that they are there for our interest. Nobody is there in Africa for the interest of the African people. It's only the African people that are there because that depends on their survival now. If your interest is not for your survival, that is your whole problem. So to think that we manage to convince the European to do something in Africa for the interest of Africa, which might be against their interest, I think it doesn't work like that. Because now we're talking of the border that the European created. Because now it looks like you create a catastrophe, you are going to solve that. It is their cause. They are up until now, 2023, the European, in their consciousness, it hasn't occurred to them that they have done something wrong in Africa, for example, that they have mismatched people together and they have not allowed these people to decide yet how they want to stay together or separate. We need to understand that everything needs to be questioned. Everything at all needs to be questioned. All right. Having said that, what is the connection between the Du Bois movement at the time and also the people in Africa? A kind of, I don't know, was there a conference that we can also reference maybe in Egypt, in Cairo, or maybe in Nigeria, in Lagos, or in Accra, or maybe a conference that was done there, and then there will be a delegate coming from US, from UK. I'm trying to see this transcontinental dialogue now going on among the African, known through the European people that are trying to negotiate, trying to help us make peace. We know how to make peace. As African people, without the intervention of the European, we can make peace. So I'm trying to see that our own doing it among ourselves. What do you want to say about that?
Well, the first part of your question, as far as conferences in Africa itself, I mean, you still have to realize this is colonial times, right? So it was hard for even though they tried to organize them, and they eventually did. Some of the congresses did end up being on the continent, and then of course Ghana became kind of the center for it for a good while because of Kwame Nkrumah. Um, but so colonial powers did not want Africans organizing in Africa. You can organize over here in Manchester where we can watch you, right? and so um, and so with that, what I will say is uh, one thing that really stood out to me is here we have Du Bois near the end of his life, in the late 1950s. He writes a speech. Um, I believe the conference is called the All African Peoples Conference, if I'm not mistaken, that was being held in Accra. And he writes the speech, but he wasn't able to deliver the speech himself. He gave it to his wife to deliver. But in that speech, you can really see that Du Bois is, his evolution is his intellectual evolution is happening here. Because in that speech, Du Bois, I think, comes the closest he ever did to discussing not the racial paradigm, which I think is an error for us to talk about this racial paradigm, because Du Bois himself even says that really race is relegating your identity down to skin color and hair texture. That's all it really is, right? But Du Bois is, it seems to me, starting to think of the cultural paradigm. What is the cultural paradigm of Africa? So in this speech, he's encouraging uh, uh, people of African descent, or people in the African continent, to, if you have a language, for example, that is not as well spoken, or as spoken as much as some of these larger languages, like Kiswahili or whatever, then perhaps you need to start thinking of submitting to those larger languages. You need to start thinking of coming together and becoming more solidified. And I think his argument was, really solidified culturally. But I had a small problem with that, even though I found that to be profound. And language wasn't the only example he gave, but he gave a few examples of, how you should kind of not lose, but see some of your uh, just kind of cede some of your culture to the larger ones, so that we can create kind of this, this composite African. And I know what he was thinking about. What he was thinking about was what was happening in Europe during the Renaissance and during the Enlightenment period, where these things started to come to be. They started to find a common cultural antecedent in Greece and Rome, although many of these people had no relation to Greece and Rome. but I think he was starting to say, okay, we need to build that type of cultural cohesion, cultural cohesion. But my critique of that was, and perhaps something that Du Bois, it wasn't really a privy to him, at least not in the same sense, even though he had some idea of this to some degree. I look at things like, and Du Bois mentions this in one of his books, The World in Africa, the Bantu migration, right? And most scholars now, or most of the scholarship, likes to call it the Bantu expansion instead of migration. And then one time I think it was called the Bantu invasion, but expansion is what's starting to be used. And with that, the Bantu language system um, is the largest language system in the African continent, right? From the highlands of Cameroon to East Africa down to the Cape Coast, right? And so in my mind, that means that uh, there is a whole lot of synthesizing that can happen when it comes to this notion of all these different languages. Not necessarily having to lower your language to another, but there's a lot of synthesizing that can happen between these languages and between cultures, that is, I believe, is very possible. People talk about uh, the syncretic nature of African people, not only on the African continent, but especially those who were taken and brought to the West, and they had to be syncretic with other religions and other cultures and stuff that are wholly foreign to Africa. But here you have a linguistic system, a phylum, if you will. If you want to extend it even further back to the Niger-Congo phylum of languages, that you can actually look for connections that actually exist, cultural connections that actually exist, that you can start synthesizing and start to create this notion of what an African is and should be. Because we all know that the notion of an African is a very new construction, right? People in the 19th century weren't going around and saying that I'm African. They would say that you're Yoruba, you're Igbo, or you're whatever your ethnicity was. But this new construction of African, if you really want to really create this Pan-African identity, then there's a cultural basis, I argue, for doing so. And it doesn't have to mean that people have to lose parts of themselves or groups have to lose parts of themselves. What it can mean is that we can do what we've always done, which is the dynamic recreation of culture, dynamic recreation of language throughout history and time, and doing that in a conscious sense is no less than when it was done unconsciously.
It becomes very important here. It becomes very important. Okay, in this series, The Life and Legacy, the one that we just published, I think that should be like 2 or 3 days ago. It was on the life and legacy of the first president of Nigeria, Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe. So the guest I was interviewing at the point we were saying that, of course, I was saying that in the recreation of Nigeria, because like I said before, Nigeria, we are in a quagmire. Our identity is a problem. We don't know where we are going. This is the most populous country in Africa. It's extremely rich. We have a lot of intelligent people in the country. We are not supposed to be like this. This is not the way it's supposed to be. We can do something. But how can we rescue the Nigerian power from the hands of very few mafias, both international and local, who just turn Nigeria into mumu? This is not who we're supposed to be. We are supposed to do better than what we are doing. In 2023, Nigeria still lives in the dark. I was saying, how many centuries ago have light been invented? How come we have a lot of university? Somebody have come out to say, we are going to provide a solution. We need this and this and this. This is what is going to be done. The road is in shambles. A lot of Nigerians are trooping away. How many Nigerians do we have in the United States? Not because they don't like their country. Because the mechanism that make up the reality of the country is so complex. And of course, this is how the West want it. And we have few people in the country who just like to be the new slave masters. All right. So what I was suggesting in the interview is that I'm not saying Europeans are the best, but because I live in Europe, I see what is happening here. I'm just making a reference. That in Nigeria, because we are looking for identity, no multiple identity that is going to cause confusion. Let's do things simple. We should have maybe one dominant language. I'm going to be provoking the sensitivity of some people. Yeah, I know, but I'm saying that. We can either pick one of them, maybe Yoruba or Hausa or Igbo. It doesn't matter. We pick one. Every other person needs to make sacrifice. This language is going to be the official language of Nigeria because you need to have an identity. We pick color that represent us. All of us are going to live and die for this identity. If we do that, even if you say US Marie to come and conquer Nigeria, it will be difficult for them because everybody will be defending this. But if we are breaking up into little pockets of interest, hey, I'm fighting for this, that is what we are fighting for, that is what we are fighting for, we look like a broom where each one each one of us is single. Even the least army in the world can conquer Nigeria.
Mm.
The proposal from Du Bois of maybe we can merge culture. It is possible. In fact, not that it is possible. This is the way it is. It have always been like this.
Mm-hmm.
In Africa, people have been moving from north to south to east to west for thousands of years. These languages that we have are creations. We create them because we want to. Let me use, okay, I will not use European example now. Let's go to Africa to use an example. If you go to the borderland between Nigeria and Niger, or between Nigeria and Benin, if you go to the border between the line, no, it will be difficult for you to know which is actually Nigeria and which is actually Niger.
Mm.
The reason is that language is a living thing. You exchange it. I speak with you all the time, so we understand each other. You understand my sentences. You understand my feeling. You know me. It is true that there is a border, a physical border, but that border doesn't really exist for us because if I need something, I come to you.
Mm-hmm.
Our language also is like that. We can talk to each other. It is when we begin to move away from each other that this language begin to have meaning. So that if you even come to a country like Europe or US or in North America, for example, you are moving between, if there is a very physical border you can reach between Canada and the United States, and people are living there, you will, at a point, you will not know what is US and what is Canada. Because they are speaking all the time, their language will mix up, their culture will mix up. Which means that it is not even a bad thing if we as a human being can accelerate this process to say that in Nigeria, for example, or in Congo, that we want to even speak English, fine. In Australia, they speak English, but their English is different from the one that is spoken in the US or in the UK. We can decide to rewrite our own English, write our dictionary, and make it the way we want it. This becomes the Nigerian English, for example. Of course, I'm using Nigeria because that is where I'm coming from. That is what I know better. So I really like that idea of deciding consciously to recreate our identity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we must do that if we want to come out of this mismatch, confusion that we are.
No, absolutely, and I think that is a must. And what you said earlier, I mean, hits the nail on the head. You know, the European colonizers, they came in, and to some degree, they created some ethnicities. You know, they created ethnicities out of, you know, groups that were actually just related clans, right? What do you call these people over here? Oh, those are the people that live by the river. So that's what we call them. Those are the people that, you know, and so they kind of created these separations in people when, if those people were to talk to each other, there might be some dialectical differences, but they can understand, you know, each other to some degree. There has to be someone, if we take Nigeria, for example, someone who is brilliant enough and brave enough to say, how do I synthesize the languages of Nigeria and give us a national language, right? How do I bring that? I mean, this doesn't mean erasing ethnicities and their, you know, but who is going to be the Alexander Pushkin of Nigeria, right? You know, who's going to be the person who says, let's perhaps even elevate one of the African scripts, one of the Nigerian scripts, you know, and let's stop using this Latin script, and let's synthesize these languages based off of that, and really create a national culture in that way. That's what it's going to take. That is what it's going to take to really bring people together.
Thank you so much for that. I appreciate that. I really do. Now we are moving to your book, but before we move there, you know, you said something important, because a lot of Africans, even because a lot of people don't even know that we have script in Africa or in Nigeria. No,
Yeah.
they don't know that we can even write. They don't know that we can even imagine the possibility that we can write. That is how bad the situation is.
Hmm.
Anyway, we will leave that for another day. Now, so you are talking about Web Du Bois today because it's something that is passionate. You are really passionate about, and you have even written a book about it, which is coming in August. Now, of course, we are not going to go deeper because I don't want you to do the spoiler for it. But of course, you can give you give people some hints. So, what prompted you to write a book about Du Bois?
I knew this question was coming. Du Bois has been a part of my consciousness for a very, very long time. I mentioned in the book that the first time I probably had any real recognition of Du Bois was in high school, my freshman year in high school. And I remember there was a poster of him in several of the classrooms that described him as, a great sociologist and, a great African American thinker, et cetera, et cetera. But I would imagine, and this is just really me guessing. I can't think of a moment that it won't visualize in my mind. But my grandfather was a history teacher for over 30 years, so I would imagine at some point in my childhood he had to have mentioned Du Bois as well. However, I do know by high school, I remember, I can visualize him being in my mind. By the time I got to college, get to undergrad, and I'm really trying to, I'm very much invested in African American identity, and so very similarly to Du Bois, even it was ever since I was a child, and really by the influence of my grandfather, I was very much into African American history, African American identity, what all of these things mean, right? Um, and and what is my own identity, what should I consider myself. And so when I get to college, I'm reading the works of Du Bois, but the very early stuff, as I said, Negro Strivings, Soul of Black Folk, Philadelphia Negro, those things that he writes at a time that he was actually younger than I am right now. and and I'm amazed, wow, this person, a brilliant thinker. I was amazed for the, in the mind frame that I was in at that time. And and the principal people that Du Bois, that I'm being taught that Du Bois was, at odds with, of course, is, well, the principal person is Booker T. Washington. So it's this notion of, liberal education versus, being taught to, uh, work in agriculture, work with your hands, right? And, being educated to be able to be self-sustaining, which, this versus, even in undergrad, I thought was ridiculous. These are things we both need, right? These are, we need to educate people to be able to work with their hands, and to be involved in agriculture, and to be involved in brick masonry, and in architecture, and all kind of stuff. But we also need people who are the thinkers, or the philosophers, or those who think of the ways to drive the culture forward, right? And so I'm getting all of this, but in the fall of 2009, I come across, so we have a new chaplain. Well, not chaplain. He wasn't a chaplain. He was actually the director of the Wesley Foundation, which was a Methodist foundation at Alabama State University. And so Dr. Stephen Redmond, he comes in as his first semester as the director of the Wesley Foundation, and he, for whatever reason, is living 3 doors down from my apartment complex. And so I remember running into uh, the manager of the apartment complex, and she says to me incorrectly that the chaplain of your school lives 3 doors down. You should go talk to him one day, right? And so I said sure. So I go talk to him, and one night, And he's not interested. I'm trying to talk to him about religion. He wasn't interested in talking about religion at all. He wants to know what I know about African American history and what I know of people like Dr. John Henrik Clarke, right, and Carter G. Woodson. That's what he wants to know from me. And I knew Carter G. Woodson, of course, had no idea who Dr. Clarke is. And I promise you, this is going to get back to Du Bois in just a moment. And, so he hands me a DVD of a documentary on John Henrik Clarke's life. John Henrik Clarke, A Great and Mighty Walk. In that documentary, I go home and I watch it, very excited to watch it. And in that documentary, Dr. Clarke, at some point, so in that documentary, Dr. John Henrik Clarke says something about Du Bois that either I had never heard before or it just didn't register to me, if I did hear it before, which was that Du Bois was the foremost Pan-African philosopher, foremost Pan-African thinker. And I said to myself, oh, okay, so Du Bois was a Pan-Africanist. I hadn't really gotten into that part of Du Bois, even though these things are happening at the same time that he's writing things like the Soul of Black Folk. He attends the first Pan-African Congress in 1900, right? But these aren't things that are really being impressed upon me. And so, me really trying to get into what Pan-Africanism is, I hear that and I think to myself, okay, there's more to Du Bois than meets the eye, right? So at that moment, not only did Dr. Clarke become kind of a posthumous mentor of mine because he had died by that time, but he had led me to avenues of Du Bois's intellectual growth that I didn't know exists. And so I start to research more about Du Bois. And the first thing I did was get David Levering Lewis's biography on Du Bois. And then I got Du Bois's own autobiographies, Dusk of Dawn, Soliloquy, and the autobiography of Du Bois. So I'm looking through his autobiographies. I really want to understand, how does he come to the conclusions that he did about his notion that, as he says in The World in Africa, that he is an African who is writing from the African point of view, right? And so, all of these things, very much influenced me to continue my research of Du Bois, even though at that time I was still I had a little bit more favoritism towards Marcus Garvey, and in some instances kind of still do, because Du Bois in some respects kind of adopted some of Garvey's politics in some respect, not wholesale, but to some degree.
All right, because you said that, I wanted you to help us understand. Was there a kind of collaboration, or how do you stack up the two, Marcus Garvey and Du Bois? Of course, we already in this series we already talked about Marcus Garvey. The video is already out there. And for those that are listening to us, it was an interesting interview. And of course, even for a particular person, we can do 2 or 3 more, because I say, if we are talking about our hero every day, it is not enough, because we need it. So tell me, how do you stack up both of them, either differently or in similarity? Say something about it.
I mean, they're two people that you can compare, but I don't really like to compare. I mean, they had 2 different approaches in their Pan-Africanism and in their in their view of what must be done for people of African descent. So Garvey had some courage in ways that Du Bois didn't have, and perhaps Du Bois had some courage in ways that Garvey didn't have. But Garvey wasn't afraid to meet with groups like the Ku Klux Klan, right? and he meets with them. He said, look, we have a common interest. You don't want us here, and we don't want to be here. So how do
Help us get out of here.
how do we come to meeting this common goal? And I never forget, Garvey does this interview on the radio, and the reporter is telling him, or the person interviewing him is saying, the things that you say, you can be hung for. And he says, there's 1 million trees between here and Africa. We can have a lynching party tonight. So Garvey was, brilliant at rhetoric, and brilliant at and at propaganda, and brilliant at propaganda in ways that Du Bois just wasn't. Du Bois was savvy enough to create, as the organ of the NAACP, the Crisis magazine. And so, he had quite a reach, because of the Crisis magazine. But Garvey, in his estimates, had millions of people reading under him, although the more conservative estimates we get from Du Bois himself, who says that he might have, a couple 100,000 as members, or at least as actual paying members of the UNIA organization. But yeah, so I mean, those two people, they very much were watching, each other. Du Bois referred to Garvey's movement as the agitation. He was afraid that the colonial powers would mix up his movement and Garvey's movement and conflate them as the same thing, and not take him seriously. But Du Bois does very interesting things, near the end of his life. He has this rivalry of sorts with people. So with Booker T. Washington, for example, he tells John Hope that he hopes not to end up in Booker T. Washington's camp, because he basically kind of sees, and this is not Du Bois's words, but this is mine and how I think he perceives the situation, as Booker T. Washington is kind of like a Negro overseer, who's using these white philanthropists' money in a way to to kind of keep a plantation going. Although that's kind of laughable in the sense of how Du Bois later in his life uses white philanthropists' money, but that's a whole other conversation. But the thing is, at the end of Du Bois's life, or near the end of his life, there's a moment where Kwame Nkrumah is kind of critiquing Booker T. Washington, and Du Bois, in a sense, tells him, young man, we neither of us have felt the lash of the master's whip on our backs, so perhaps we should not, critique him in that way. And then he speaks kind of highly of Garvey after Garvey dies. He still kind of sees Garvey as this was someone who was getting ahead of himself, and his dreams and the way he wished to have them wouldn't be realized. But he felt that Garvey was actually earnest in his love for African people, and for wanting to realize his dream of bringing about an Africa for the Africans, right? An Africa that, in an African world that had its own autonomy, that had its own sovereignty. So Du Bois, in his reflections, at 70, 80, and 90 years of age, it's very interesting.
Thank you for that. I promise this is the last question I will ask about it too, because they're too important for us. So anyway, all right. Now, Du Bois and Marcus Garvey are both alive, and they are both in their different movement. Is there any time we can say that they ever meet physically to engage? It could be maybe either during those conferences that were organized, or maybe an attempt to meet each other one on one to talk, to express idea for a common front. Is there anything we can know about that?
I don't know if I know they've definitely been in the same space as each other. Du Bois definitely went to some meetings that Garvey was at. So I know they were in the same space. I don't know if they were ever close enough physically to each other to to shake hands or anything like that. But they definitely had correspondences with each other and some quite ugly things to say about each other to each other in those correspondences. But clearly, because of their conversations, I mean, there was one time that and Garvey could have been just mocking Du Bois, but Garvey essentially says that his organization is hosting an election to find out who should be the president of of all of Africa. And Du Bois is one of the candidates, and will he put his name in the ring? And Du Bois basically responds, "Absolutely not. I don't want anything to do with your craziness, right?" So there was definitely correspondences with Du Bois, but there's something interesting that I want to point out about Du Bois is that I mentioned before he was 95 years old when he died, right? This is a person who, and I don't think people, understand the significance of this. This was a person who was coming into prominence during the time of Frederick Douglass in, the late 19th century, during the time of Frederick Douglass. And he is contemporary with Frederick Douglass, with Booker T. Washington, with Marcus Garvey, with A. Philip Randolph, with all of these, very, famous figures that we kind of see and think of like just in the background, or in not the background, but just kind of in very early civil rights history, right? Not, the period that we think about as the civil rights period. But he's, he's a contemporary of all these people, and he dies the night before the March on Washington, right? So he dies at the height, or the day before what was ostensibly the height of Martin Luther King's career. So this is very significant. This is Du Bois, and is interesting. The next morning during the March on Washington, um, uh, people are telling each other, like the whispers are getting around that Du Bois has died, right? But the way they referred to him as it wasn't Du Bois, it was the old man. They said the old man has died, and everyone knew who they were talking about, because this is someone who has been so significant in the lives of African Americans, and in the lives of people of African descent, in various portions of the world, and even in the African continent. So a very, very significant individual, very significant person that should the totality of his life should really be further investigated in a way that that brings out his later theories, which I think, if I could say, that Du Bois would be more appreciative if the things that he thought of in the end of his life was considered in greater light than the things he was thinking of at the beginning of his career. So yeah.
Thank you for that. But I think that is really a great thing. Yeah, thank you for pointing out that. Also for the fact that he entered prominence quite early in his life, and he was able to say what he had to say with the spirit of youthfulness in him,
Mm.
and then growing old, 95 before he died, unable to speak and express himself again. we can then compare and contrast to see what is actually the evolution of the human being and how we think and how we see the things, no? In Africa, it is said that what a man sees sitting down on the chair, a child that is on top of the tree cannot see it. It is true. And of course, it have a deeper meaning other than just the figurative way that we might think of that. But it is a good thing. For, like you said, for those people who are interested to investigate the life of this individual in a particular way, it is interesting, very interesting, because we are all product of our society and our experiences. All right, now talking of your book,
Mm.
what do you want people to look up to? I want you to give them something that what should they be expecting to get at the end of, because you say it will be out by August, right?
Mhm.
Okay, what are they looking up to?
Well, the first thing is this to me is the first Afrocentric analysis of Du Bois and his thinkings and writings towards Africa. The first extensive Afrocentric analysis of that, I should say. Of course, there have been articles and other things, and then there's been Afrocentric analysis of Du Bois in other ways, particularly by scholars such as Raylan Rabaka, right? But this is the first extensive Afrocentric analysis of how Du Bois decided to write about African history and African politics and things of that nature. So that's one thing to look forward to. The other thing is, I mentioned Carter G. Woodson earlier, and so just one thing I really like about Carter G. Woodson is that he spent his life, or his early career, being supported by these Methodist philanthropists, and then he immediately, or came to an immediate conclusion that he needs to break away from them and to support himself and receive the supporting from other Black folks. So in given that context, Du Bois is often pitted against, Booker T. Washington, as that these two people were the they had this real rivalry, which they did to some extent, right? But it wasn't, to me, in a I think he and Marcus Garvey had maybe an even bigger rivalry that got really ugly, right? But I say, or at least I believe, and I say it in the book, that his real rival, intellectual rival, was Carter G. Woodson. Carter G. Woodson was the second person to get a Ph.D. in history from Harvard University. Du Bois was the first. And so here you have this, this youngster, in a sense, coming out, getting his PhD from Harvard and studying principally the same things, the African American and African history and culture. And Carter G. Woodson and Du Bois are kind of seen as these premier figures in terms of an African American who understands African history and African culture and African American history and culture, right? And so there's this moment where Du Bois is well, let me back up. Du Bois and Carter G. Woodson are a little upset over the fact that the Anson folks, I know I'm not getting the name right, but it's like Phelps. I think the Anson Phelps Foundation. They, hosted by the person himself, Anson. He wants to create an encyclopedia of the Negro, right? He and some other philanthropists, they come together, some white philanthropists. They want to create the Encyclopedia of the Negro. And the first meeting in wanting to create this, neither Du Bois nor Carter G. Woodson are invited to, and they both take it as a slight, right? They both were like, "You don't invite us, to this, to create this journal. Like we are who we are, right?" And everyone knew who they were at the time. The second meeting, Du Bois is invited to, and Du Bois is then asked to be the editor of the encyclopedia. And Du Bois writes Carter G. Woodson, and he says to Carter G. Woodson, he says, "Listen, I know that you have, you're going to have your reservations towards this, but the reason why I agreed to this was not because, of these white philanthropists, but because of the rest of the committee who impressed upon me the need for this." And he says, "Listen, the enemy has the money, and either they use it for their own means, or we use their money for our own means." And Carter G. Woodson, the kind of the epitome of his response to this is, "My dear Du Bois, I do not accept the gifts of the Greeks." and I just thought, that's, if everything I had been reading about Carter G. Woodson, that is so Woodson. He said, "Listen, I don't have faith in these people, and you shouldn't have faith in them either. I don't accept the gifts of the Greeks. I will go on to do, my own plans for my own scholarship in my own way, and have it funded either by myself or others that look like me. I'm not going to rely on them." And one thing that I could say about that is, Woodson, he should be recognized more than he already is. I mean, he's recognized as the father of Black history, right? Because he created Negro History Week, which became Black History Month in America, and then that kind of spread throughout. But I think Woodson should be really placed up there as an intellectual and ideological rival with Du Bois.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you. I really do appreciate that. But I do have a question there that I'd like to ask you.
Mm.
Now, Du Bois and Carter G. Woodson, we get a Ph.D., both of them from Harvard, for African American history and African history. But who is teaching them this history? Are they the same white people who have the masters, they know everything, they are teaching them to these Black people? I'm sort of curious about that. That is also in line with these white philanthropists who want to create the African History Dictionary, or for what?
Mm. So Du Bois himself, I mean, although he did find some influence in the way he does history, the way he does sociology, from the professors that he was around at Harvard, but he took it upon himself to write the suppression of the slave trade, which was his dissertation, right? And in that, that entailed him having some understanding, some cursory understanding at least, of West African history, of that time period, right? And then an understanding of what is happening to African Americans in this process of becoming, or what is happening from Africa in this process of becoming enslaved. But he certainly has to deal with and dealt with throughout his life the what I would call today the Eurocentric ideologies that's that would kind of hinder his work to some degree. But Du Bois, his brilliance in works like the Philadelphia Negro, or even the Soul of Black Folk, but also um, the Negro Church. His brilliance in those kinds of works is that he's doing himself these sociological surveys, and he is presenting, a true sociological survey um, from what he's gaining of the perspectives of African Americans, but also of course his own perspective of what's happening in his own lived experience, right? So a lot of that has some Afrocentric merit to it, but of course he's somewhat plagued by um, the Eurocentric um, methods and Eurocentric perception of people of African descent. And you can see that. You see that very early on in his writings, but much later in his life, you start to see how he's evolving. There's a moment in The World in Africa where he talks about uh, these African chiefs who have this beautiful regalia, right? And they've traded it for secondhand clothing and top hats, from Europe, and have been convinced that these are, the the best of kind of regalia in Europe. And so and the Europeans are getting these beautiful cloths and things that are worth a lot of money from them and trading it for something that's worth nothing, and so he laments on that, and he says that the African has been made to think that his culture is less than or evil or et cetera, and that the Europeans' culture is so much superior. So he does have those moments where where he definitely is going against his the ideologies of even people who trained him, right? Um, and so he grows. He grows a lot. Carter G. Woodson, very very much the same thing. If you read the Miseducation of the Negro, and even the Education of the Negro, which is a much longer text that he wrote, Carter G. Woodson talks about the fact that African Americans are taught the history and language of the Anglo-Saxons or the Teutons, the people of Germanic descent, right? But they're not taught at all the history of Africa or who they are in terms of their African identity. And he even lambasts historically Black universities for continuing this, for focusing on Greek and Latin and things of that nature, and not focusing on African languages, and wanting to give their students an education that was grounded in African epistemology, right? He said that's a really big problem, and Carter G. Woodson is writing these things during a time where he himself is really studying African history. He writes, one of the earliest book of African folklore. It was principally meant for children, but this is Carter G. Woodson and this is Du Bois. So clearly, something within them started to realize that that the West is never going to paint the history and the identity of African people in any light that would serve to uplift those very people, and not going to really recognize or acknowledge the genius of African heritage and African culture, right? And so they started to, they said, if the West is not going to do it, we will have to do it ourselves.
Thank you for that. Thank you for very much for that, Dr. Ade. That is very important. It looked like what we were saying before the beginning. No, actually, sometime in the middle, that the opposition. Okay, let me call it competitor for so at least nobody's offended. The Europeans are the competitors to Africans. No, they are there in Africa for their interest because this is a market, this is a business. They are not there for the humanitarian agenda. That is just a hoax. It's not true. And nobody is there for the humanitarian agenda. So if they are there for a business now, let's call them our business competitor, and we are allowing them to teach us how to survive in the business. We are going to lose. Of course, we are going to lose. It's logical that they will teach us something that will make us lose. It's quite strange. Okay, now you see, the first interview that I did with you, at the point I was asking you, I think with you or some other professors or so, it was what is the collaboration that is going on right now as we currently speak between some US university and universities in Africa, or maybe between US professors and professors of Africa that are living in Africa that are teaching, kind of so that we can have a reference, so we can both feed on each other in terms of knowledge. Because knowledge is nothing more than the experience that we put down now for other people to learn from. Because if Du Bois and Kadaju Wisim are learning everything from the West, of course, we see that that is not what happened at the end of the day. That is not the whole thing that happened, because they will re-educate themselves. Basically, you get education, that is fine to get the qualification. Now you're going to re-educate yourself if you need to stand out. And I think they did both of them. And that is why we respect them in our community. But what I actually want to point out there is if we can point anything out in terms of if they have done also some studies in Africa, if they have collaborated with some people coming from Africa, if they have done anything outside the European watch, because this is what I think it is. The Europeans basically are telling Africans in Africa that, don't worry, I will tell you what the Africans in the diaspora are thinking. They go back to the same African in the diaspora and tell them, hey, don't worry, I will tell you what the Africans in Africa are thinking. That is what is reflected in their books. That is what is reflected in their movie. That is what is reflected in everything they do. But what I'm saying is that we don't need to do that. We need to boycott them. If you are an African historian, you don't need to just read the European books. You need to go to Africa or look for somebody who is an African, who is going to speak to you from the point of view of an African to tell you, this is who I am. I am your brother. We can both learn from each other. So this is from the point of view of trying to understand if Du Bois or Kadaju Wisim have had the chance to be able to learn outside the European watch of the reality of Africa. Help me with that.
Well, I mean, I could say that Du Bois himself was doing just that. I mean, he dies in Ghana, right? He travels to Ghana. He was very good friends with Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah was somewhat of a mentee of his. Kwame Nkrumah, and this speaks to the age-old cross-cultural connection, cross-political connections that we have, between African Americans and Africans in the continent and those in the Caribbean as well. Kwame Nkrumah comes to Pennsylvania and attends Lincoln University, which is a historically Black college, right? Not before long, he is introduced to Du Bois. They develop some type of, mentee mentorship, and Du Bois ends up in Ghana. And remember that Encyclopedia of the Negro that I mentioned before. Du Bois takes that project, takes the kind of, the basis of that project, and in Ghana, he has now renamed it the Encyclopedia Africana, right? And Nkrumah has given him kind of an editorial team to work this out. And Nkrumah says to this team, and this is perhaps the first time, this word goes down in history. He says to this team that Du Bois and I agree that this work should be an Afrocentric work, right? That this should be done from the African point of view. And so we have the historical basis for these types of relationships, across the Atlantic. And so very recently, I was approached by a very good friend of mine who is from South Africa. He's a professor at the University of South Africa, and his name is Lehasa Malloy. And he and I are actually meeting tomorrow because we're planning to write a book on an edited volume on Afrocentric approaches to decolonization, to in African history, African culture, just a variety of things that we feel needs to be talked about, but talked about from the Afrocentric point of view. So, I mean, there's definitely, and it's not just me, of course. There's many scholars who are doing very similar things with scholars from the African continent. One other person who is a historian, but I look up to in terms of just the sheer amount of things he's had published, is a Nigerian by the name of Toyin Falola, right? And who's perhaps the most published African scholar in the world. And he does those kinds of things all the time. He bridges connections with scholars throughout the African world. And so these things are happening.
Thank you so much for that. It need to happen and need to continue to happen because we have no reason why it should not happen. Anyway, I did say it the other time though, the last time that we were here, that the Europeans, they are very clever. They are in the United States. They are bringing their people to come and study the history of Rome.
Mm.
This is for they are not making mistakes. So the same way we should be looking for a way to send a Black African to learn about Zimbabwe, to learn about ancient Benin, to learn about the script. For example, we have the ECBD script, for example, and many other scripts from Africa. We should be intentionally doing that. Our academic expert should really be pushing that into the people. It's only recently that we are talking of a direct flight from Africa to the Caribbean. I was asking somebody I was interviewed, why is it taking on that long to do this? Anyway, it's quite funny sometimes. Anyway, that's by the way.
If I could say something on that,
please.
I think that the African world's most prolific fighter for scholar who fought for just what you're talking about is Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop, right? Some people say Cheikh Anta Diop. The Senegalese polymath. He was a multi-genius. And he studied history, language, chemistry, all kinds of things. Now the thing about him is that, which is the thing about most scholars, is that as more information becomes available, theories and ideas start to become outdated. Now, that doesn't mean that the theories themselves cannot be advanced upon, because there's core elements of those theories that hold some truth. I was reading through Kevin Shillington's The History of Africa, his 4th edition. And, I just thought, this is an Africanist scholar. So, of course, he's going to have some leanings in this way. But I thought it very interesting that he acknowledged that Cheikh Anta Diop, in his hypothesis of the Africanness of the ancient Egyptians is bearing truth in all of the available evidence that we're getting today. And then also, I would say that Cheikh Anta Diop's thesis of cultural unity in African people, and his pushing for an African federated state. The more we research African history, the more we realize just how much of a cultural basis that there is for that. No matter if he had some of his linguistic, data wrong, or if he had some of, some things wrong in other ways, the core of his theories of this cultural unity of Africa, that is something, Diop should be really elevated in the African world for that. And he was, he is to some extent, but those are things, his cross-cultural comparative analysis is something that really should be employed more. We do a lot of comparative analysis between Africans and Europeans and Africans and Asians. We don't do enough between Africans and Africans, right? We don't do enough to really understand, to try to really understand that that the African world should start to unite on these cultural bases. And so, yeah, that's what I wanted to say to that.
Thank you so much for that. That is important, absolutely important. I appreciate that. All right, now, the life and legacy of W.E.B. Du Bois, your upcoming book. So, if you were to say this is the central message that you want to outline in your book, this is something that somebody can get. I don't know if you can even say that, but anyway, I'm just saying it. The central piece of the book, no, for the fact that the book is not yet out, and that is why I'm just saying that. So, what would that be, for example, or a kind of way to suscitate the people that are listening? Yeah.
Central message is that Du Bois should not be relegated and frozen in time in his 30s and 40s, as if that is the climax of his intellectual thought, right? That he, while he had very Eurocentric subjectivities that plagued him throughout his life, even at the end of his life, he continuously grew intellectually, continuously grew in a more Afrocentric way, and so to view the totality of his life and the totality of the life of of all of our scholars really is very important, and to be able to analyze all aspects of his life is very important. And so that's the central kind of message that I'm trying to get across in that book, other than that Du Bois also was starting to move towards a cultural paradigm in order to unite African people. And I feel that I push that argument forward for the necessity of a cultural paradigm juxtaposed to the racial paradigm, because the racial paradigm will always be dominated by Europe.
All right. And again, that book is going to be available by August, so people should get ready to get copy for themselves. All right. Now, looking at today, 2023, what do ordinary Americans, or maybe let's say the African American, think of Du Bois? And when they think of Du Bois, what do they, or how much do they think of him as a figure?
The average African American, they think, I would imagine, thinks highly of Du Bois. And I say I imagine because, just in my own experience, the average African American thinks very highly of Du Bois. They think of him as, a prolific intellectual, one of our quote unquote greats, right? So from my experience, the average African American thinks very highly of Du Bois. I don't think most people think negatively of him at all. He's considered one of our quote unquote greats, one of our great intellectuals. And, but my charge is, again, to really consider the totality of Du Bois's scholarship, the totality of his life, the totality of his intellectual growth. And that doesn't mean that there aren't scholars who do that. And then there aren't scholars, there's those who have tried to uh, uh, categorize his intellectual growth into like three different phases, which I find to be problematic to some degree. Uh, but the principal theories that are pushed when it comes to Du Bois are the theories that he developed very, very early in his life. And so I argue that something that he really put more stock into theorizing was what he called Pan-Africa, right? And that is, I think, that was the culmination of his ideas for people of African descent, and the culmination of his ideas of identity.
All right. Thank you so much for that. Now, is it possible that Du Bois, in the course of his career, doing what he was doing, he could have had some challenges, some difficulty in the Menji or sustaining his idea that maybe you want to share with us?
Um, I mean, I think very early on he was definitely challenged by trying to figure a way uh, to free Africa, quote unquote, in a sense, from its, colonial struggle, right, and from these colonial powers, but doing it in a way that, at the same time, did not totally upset the colonial power structure, because he realized they have all the power, and in at any moment they can decide to move in and try to shut his whole operations down. And he knew that he was being followed. I mean, his him going to so here's a few examples of that. In the 1950s, there was a genocide conference that was held by what was at that time what would be considered the United Nations, right? The kind of League of Nations. And at this conference, Du Bois, or before this conference, Du Bois drafted something that we call today "We Charge Genocide." And Du Bois argued that what has happened to African Americans is equitable to genocide in this country. And Du Bois, being under the eye of the American government as a possible communist during the time of the Red Scare and all these things, which Du Bois definitely had socialist and or communist leanings. He uh, he was watched very much so, and he was not allowed to go to the genocide conference. He wasn't given granted visa to go there, and so he secretly had the documents mailed to an associate of his, who then presented these documents at the conference. Right. Another thing that happened with Du Bois is that when he goes to Ghana at the end of his life, his intention wasn't to actually stay in Ghana. He wanted to come back to the United States, but the United States effectively barred him from coming back. And I don't think he necessarily, he might have lamented this to some degree. He had friends and family and things of that nature he would want to see, and that kind of thing. But I think he welcomed this as the next stage of his life. So, but that definitely perhaps hindered some of his political activities in the United States. Well, I mean, did hinder his political activities. He couldn't step foot here. Another challenge, which is just not the challenge of peoples and nations, but the challenge of life, is that he was never able to complete the Encyclopedia Africana. He died before its completion, and so and that, I'm sure, he wanted to be one of the kind of magnum opus moments of his scholarship, but it was never completed, at least not under his editorship.
Thank you so much for that. Anyway, I'm not going to ask you why it was actually banned. If he was a citizen of the United States, why his country decided to ban him. Because anyway, that would take less of his own. Maybe that for another day.
Mm.
I want to thank you so much for the time. We have spent more than 2 hours discussing the life and legacy of Du Bois, and of course he deserved it. He as an individual deserved the time, and thank you so much for that. So, what would you consider his greatest legacy, and how would you conclude the conversation, leaving the message in line with why people should care about this particular individual in the history of the United States?
Du Bois, what I considered about his legacy is that, at least from my perspective, from my point of view, as someone who is a Pan-Africanist, as someone who is an Afrocentrist, who is an Africologist, is that Du Bois's legacy and the usefulness of Du Bois's scholarship, from my perspective, is that there is a roadmap for scholars and for, just people in general, for them to look at the life of Du Bois and his approach to African people and to African history and to African politics and African diaspora history and politics as well, and culture, and look at this and see the evolution of his thought throughout his life, if you read throughout his works, but also understand that this was a person that is considered one of the most brilliant people. I mean, he's really considered one of the fathers of sociology, not, just African American sociology, but sociology, period, right? One of the fathers of the field. Someone who comes in as the field is just becoming a field, is just branching out of the field of history, right? So this significant figure is so earnestly, because of his understanding and because of his heart towards the African world, he so earnestly believes and understands himself to be an African, and believes and understands African Americans and others of the diaspora to be African, and understands that people in Africa should have autonomy, should have sovereignty, and should be and should have those things on their own terms, not on borrowed terms. Should have sovereignty and autonomy on their own terms, not on borrowed terms, meaning from their own cultural paradigms, they should have this African autonomy. And so that, to me, that's something that people should really consider when they're looking at the life of Du Bois.
Thank you so much for that. I appreciate the time. I appreciate also the sharing. Yes, the life and legacy of Du Bois is very important, that people pay attention to him, to individuals such as these who have made a lot of contribution to the life of his people. But why are we talking about them? We're talking about them because we have a lot to learn from them. We want to know their passes so we can avoid the mistake that they have made and reinforce the positive side of their progress. Because like I said before, it is a journey. It is not ended. We are still on the road. So we need to learn from those who have been here before us, so we can know how to continue to play our part in the journey. Because we are not going to be here forever, but we are playing our part now, learning from those who have been here before us, so that other people will also learn from maybe what we could have been able to contribute to the journey. So thank you so much. I appreciate the time. I really do.
I appreciate you, brother.
If you enjoy this podcast, make sure you subscribe so you never miss any of our future episodes. Rate and review Obehi Podcast and share with your friends who might need it. I remain Obehi Ewafo. Thank you so much for listening, and talk to you in the next episode.